and looking at the idea that you should do what you set out to do. And this is a really interesting one because there's a whole load of focus on getting to the finish and kind of getting things done. And it can quite often be a good thing, but there's an awful lot when you're exploring uncertain situations and less certain situations where doing things and learning things absolutely changes the goal and changes how you should be approaching things. So I think it's a really interesting one to explore and all of these things to get into. So today's guest is Kirsty Starmer. Welcome to the show, Kirsty.
Thank you.
It's great to have you on. If Delightful Dissent, if you're new to the show, Delightful Dissent is really about thinking about things differently and taking the other approach, taking a different approach than the conventional one. And when you do that, you often hit barriers of kind of implicit beliefs and shoulds, the things you kind of feel that you should be doing and other people tell you should be doing, and bad things will happen if you don't, but that don't really serve you. And so this is a show about challenging those and unpicking those and working with those. And I hope it will give you some ideas specifically around the ones that we're talking about today and how you can work with them. But equally, it's intended to really give you some ideas about how you can go out there and challenge these yourself. Because for me, I'd like everyone to be able to go out there and challenge the orthodoxy, think about things differently, and really, take a different approach. And it's delightful dissent because, we're dissenting, we're challenging these ideas, but we're doing so in a kind of fun, light, joyful way. It's not about proving that we're right and everyone else is wrong. It's more of an exploration and an understanding about things, and just adding to the understanding and the things that the approaches that we can take. The show is genuinely live, so do bear with us if there are any technical problems or any interruptions or anything, but equally do be aware that we might cover some slightly challenging personal topics and there might be strong language. So just know that that's coming up if that's something that's a concern for you. There aren't any perfect answers here, and this is really about kind of challenging yourself and thinking about it and thinking about what we're saying. Do you, does this resonate for you? If it does, please, reach out. And if it doesn't, please ask questions, explore. You can ask questions in the chat and we'll bring them in whilst we're speaking, or reach out to either of us. At the end of the show, we'll be sharing details on how you can do that as well. So, so Kirsty is, I think, yet another person that I met at a Happy Startup School event, which is starting to be a bit of a recurring theme in this show. So, but when I was really struck by kind of her energy and her really kind of just a light and fun, but effective approach to getting stuff done, and it's a rare combination, so I really wanted to have her on the show. Kirsty, could you just describe your work a little bit and the kind of people that you like to work with, please?
Yeah, sure. I've basically been a project manager for far longer than I can actually remember. I think probably edging on about 15 years now, maybe longer, not sure. And over that time, I've worked in various different organisations. I've worked in financial institutions. I've worked in digital agencies, in e-learning spaces. And what it all effectively has come down to now is that I provide freelance project management, project consultancy for organisations that are trying to do things a little bit differently. And it tends to be very much there tends to be a lot of content, a lot of creativity, a lot of people who don't necessarily approach the world in the same way. And I like to think that I add a little bit of a different approach to project management into it, a little bit more fun, a little bit less box ticking of documentation and endless Gantt charts and things like that. Because for me, project management is asking the right questions at the right time so that we can get the right stuff done, so that people get the problems solved that they need solved. And it can be fun, it can be difficult, but generally it's the people that make it fun.
Yeah, that's great. And I think it's really interesting. It's another reason I kind of, it's nice to have you on the show, is because I've, my background is tech and development stuff, and often project managers project managers are not welcome people always in tech development. So amongst techies, so I think it's really nice to hear an approach that actually is genuinely supportive and is genuinely helpful. So that's another reason I really wanted to get your kind of your take on this out there and into the world.
Yes, so, I've definitely walked into rooms with techies before and seen the heads go down and turn away from the project manager as she comes into the room. But
yeah. And I think this is actually some of the stuff that we're probably going to get into today, and the some of the ideas behind, you know, really getting to a specific outcome and not learning as you go, that really are one of the things that make working with some people so difficult, you know, because techies are usually all about, you know, it's all about change and learning, and particularly, you know, my background in agile and working with agile, and it's like, well, if we've got this really fixed goal, then we can't really do that. And it just becomes really frustrating, and then you end up doing loads of busy work that isn't really valuable work, and so I think it's a really important one to get into and look at. But before we do, I like to ask people for a quote that supports their position a little bit and adds a different perspective on things. So do you have something you could share with us, please?
I do indeed. It's quite a long one, so I'm going to read it.
Cool.
And it's by Roald Dahl. And I began to realize how important it was to be an enthusiast in life. If you're interested in something, no matter what it is, go at it full speed. Embrace it with both arms, hug it, love it, and above all, become passionate about it. Lukewarm is no good.
Thank you. I love that. It's a beautiful quote. I think what's interesting for me is how does that relate to this work for you? Because I think certainly conventionally, there probably isn't a direct link between like being really passionate about something and loving something and project management.
No, traditionally, no, definitely not. In corporate world, I think the chasm is quite wide. I don't think that we can achieve good things without being passionate about it in some way, whether it's being passionate about the team that you work with, or passionate about your part that you play in a team that is delivering a project. There has to be something in there somewhere, because if it's the places that I've worked where projects just either drag on and on and on, or you produce something really rubbish that no one really cares about, or the client's unhappy, or whatever it is, it's always when it's something that you're being forced to do in a way that you don't want to do, that no one really has, that's out of your control because it's not in your wheelhouse. You can't be enthusiastic or passionate about something when it's like that. And I think that's where drawing in, finding out what the problem is that you need to solve for the client or for your employer or whoever it is that you're working for, and understanding what your team of people, what they can bring to that problem, rather than going, right, you are going to deliver this thing how we want you to deliver it, and now go. That's it. Completely takes away any ownership, any sense of investment in the thing that's being delivered, and that's where the passion is.
I think the interesting thing for me is you know, I've talked about compassion on this show quite a lot before, but that passion is etymologically kind of means suffering. And it's like, you know, it's like what and so that relationship with the problem is a really interesting one. It's like what actually bothers us, you know, and that feels like a really interesting question, because so much of work, you know, particularly in big organizations, you can lose sight of that personal relationship with why you're doing it and what you're doing, and that is just, it's always going to be boring, and it's always going to be kind of dispiriting, and it's never going to make anything terribly inspiring to use or work with either. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, you could argue that anything that you do in any kind of project, there is an awful lot of suffering. Because one way or another, it's always going to be a lot more difficult than what you think it will be at the beginning.
Yeah, I think we just choose our flavor of suffering, don't we? I mean, it's like
Yeah.
we just sometimes you just say, yeah, there's always going to be pain. It's just choose the one that you like.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's the that feels like the approach to me. But yeah, cool. So the assumption we're talking about today is do what you set out to do. So what is it that really made you want to explore this? What does this mean for you?
What does it mean to me? Blimey. The contrast between me in my job, if you like, and me as me, with regard to that statement, couldn't be more diverse, I guess, because as a project manager, you're given a target, you're given an endpoint, and everything that you do needs to get you to that point. Whereas as an individual and in the way that I tend to work with people, I tend to look at more, what is it that I'm, not what am I trying to do, as in what the outcome is, but who am I trying to become, or where do I want to be, or what is the, come back to the, what is the problem I'm trying to solve thing. And if you set out to do what you intend to do, that tends to mean to create a thing or to build a company or to make a certain amount of money. It tends to be very, very kind of specific. Whereas for me, I've kind of meandered down very many kind of tangential paths, and I'm still trying to get to where I want to get to. And I will get there eventually, I'm sure, at some point. But there are lots of little, I've achieved something points along the way that matter just as much, if not more so, than any one big goal at the end, in my mind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely something we've explored on the show before, in this relationship between actually like achieving a specific goal and enjoying the process, and that the goal, you know, I use the metaphor of dance or music, playing a piece of music, rather than being like, you know, the point of playing a piece of music is not to get to the end. It's a different thing. And so if we approach, you know, and approaching our work entirely in terms of outcomes and in terms of like, what do I get, makes it very cold and very transactional and very kind of limited and hard to engage with, and also potentially quite exploitative, because it's all about projecting power onto the world and forcing the world to be a certain way and to behave a certain way, and therefore forcing people to behave a certain way. And it can turn quite nasty for me. I think it's actually quite an unpleasant place to be when we're trying to force that thing to happen.
It's also, I think, quite disempowering, because like my personal reference would be sport. In a sport, if you're playing a tournament or a match, the idea is obviously you want to win that match, but you have no control over that. So you can't actually control whether you get the outcome that you want. All you control is point by point the steps that you need to take to get there. And you go back a level. All you can do to control the points is what you're doing at that one split moment in time. When, you know, if I'm a beach volleyball player, when you contact the ball, when you talk to your partner in a certain way, each of those touch points magnified may or may not give you the end result, because you can't control what the other team is doing. You can't control what the weather is doing. You can't control all of these things. But you know, at the end of the game, if you've done as well as you can, you will be a better player. You will have learned something that you can take forward into the next game. And I think those are the things that mean more than potentially even getting that end result. If you've played badly, learned nothing, taken nothing out of it, what do you do with that for the next time? Because there will always be a next time.
Yeah, I think what comes up for me in that is actually more what happens if you play well, like you play well but don't learn anything. You know, is that you kind of look at these players and assume that they've kind of always won, and that actually how you relate to those experiences of the unexpected, of stuff happening that you didn't quite want, and also play to your strengths. The other thing that comes up for me is in non-adversarial sports, or slightly less adversarial sports, where you're kind of running your own race, and actually what other people are doing around you, the fact that there's someone in front of you at this point is kind of immaterial in terms of how, because you know how to work with you and you know how to optimize your overall time. So yeah, maybe they stay in front of you the whole race, or maybe they slow down, or maybe that's their optimal race. And it's like, you can't control that either. And if you try and catch up with them, you'll actually move away from that, your best way of running your race. And it's a different thing, it's a really interesting thing, I think, for me, around exploring that and how we relate to that, but the need to kind of be in front, showing progress.
Yeah. I've been training for a marathon recently, and I know that my body is not particularly well put together to be doing loads of long training runs, 19, 20 miles week on, week out. So I decided to take on a plan that was based on your heart rate, that you had to stick to throughout these various different runs. And it became really evident that if I repeatedly tried outrunning that heart rate, because there was someone running past me on the seafront and I kind of didn't want them to go past me, or whatever it was, I burnt out so much quicker than if I'd have just kept to that pace. And when I actually did a marathon a couple of years ago using that system, and I was religiously kind of sticking to what my heart rate was telling me I needed to be doing, I got out of it fine. And I never ran more than 9 miles in my training. And it was just a different way of doing it that worked for me. But it meant I had to stick to what my body was telling me I needed to do. And it's the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really fascinating one. And I think this kind of brings me into another side of doing what you set out to do, and like measurement and metrics, progress. So is if you're really clear about an outcome, and you stick to that outcome, you can measure this kind of linear progress towards a goal. And I don't think I've certainly... So I specifically work with hard problems and complex problems as well. That's the other thing that everyone I work with and I works with and that I work with. And they are kind of non-linear. By definition, they're complex problems. So you don't know when the system's going to tip. You don't know if the system's going to do something different, even though you did exactly the same thing. Just like you said, you don't have control over the opposition. And you don't have control over the referee. You don't have, these things are unexpected. And so trying to measure that kind of linear progress where it's just like slightly better, slightly better, slightly better, in terms of the measuring an outcome, doesn't really work very well.
No.
I think it's a really interesting one. And I think certainly in a lot of organizations, it's like, well, why aren't we making progress towards this goal? It's like, well, we found a whole load of things that didn't work.
Yeah.
And that's somehow finding a whole load of things that didn't work doesn't count as progress in some places.
Yeah, we need to change that somehow. Change the measurement. And it is the momentum curve, though, isn't it? It's often when people are starting up their own businesses and things, they're doing all the things and they expect to see that kind of consistent progress where, maybe if they're building an online business, maybe I'll get this many followers this week and then this many followers this week, and the more if they stay consistent, they expect it to grow like that. But actually what tends to happen is that it's really, really slow, and then there's like that tipping point, and then all of a sudden it picks up and everything's fine. But so many people kind of give up before it starts on that up curve because it feels so demoralizing, and they're kind of looking at where they are relative to the end goal, rather than just sticking in the wonder of what it is that they're doing at that moment in time, and with that passion of like, I'm doing this because, rather than I'm doing it because of that end goal that I'm looking at there.
I think it's a huge, for me, I certainly sense a huge kind of pressure around being kind of doing stuff focused on the goal. And it's like, well, this is interesting and I'm enjoying it, so I should stop because it's not immediately resulting in an outcome. That's and I do feel that pressure sometimes, even when you're running my own business and doing my own thing. It's like in being interested, like doing interesting things is a huge thing for me. If I'm not doing something I'm interested in, I have particular difficulty. I know this is true for everyone, but I have particular difficulty, clinical difficulty, in paying attention to stuff that I'm not interested in. And so it's like, but the idea that we should forego any interest in things just to do something that results in an outcome, that might give us something we think we want. It's a strange way to approach life, honestly, for me. But it's a real, like, it's deeply in there in the way that we're supposed to approach work in particular.
I mean, it's there from the minute we step foot into school. Like, it's all of our subjects are separated into like little streams. You go to maths, you go to science, you go to art as a very specific thing, and however they teach you in each of those subjects may be more or less interesting depending on the teacher you have, depending on everything that's involved in it. But you know that the end goal is that you have to pass your exam no matter what, no matter how interested you are in it, no matter anything. Because if you don't pass that exam in the end, you can't kind of basically be adopted into society as an adult. And that pressure is there from the get-go. And I think I can remember when I was in school, when we had to kind of choose whether we went down, I think, the humanities route or the sciences route. Can't remember what the choices were, but I had to choose between history and geography. And I was quite an academic student. I got A's pretty much across the board. So for me, it became not a which one am I better at, which one do I like more? And I went with history because I like stories and I like kind of following people's lives. And my geography teacher approached my mum at the parents' evening, and I can remember her kind of going, well, why didn't Kirsty choose to take geography? And my mum was like, well, she's just not interested. She's not interested. She doesn't want to do it. She wants to do history, So, well, that's not a very good point, is it? Just that whole, you don't have to be interested in it thing. You're good at it, therefore do it. And I noticed, like, my daughter goes to a Montessori school, and it's all based on projects. So the maths, the science, everything, there's no end goal. It's all child-led. It's all kind of projects. So whatever they're working on, they bring everything into it, and they're always interested in it. The path they follow, they still end up with all of the boxes ticked from an Ofsted point of view. But they're doing it in a way that the project, the end goal, as it were, is actually just for the kids to learn in a way that keeps them interested, and that's how it works. And it's in my mind, it's very obvious the distinction between how she's growing and learning and how the education that we went through as we went through school in a traditional school, and what that results in once you get into the workplace, because it's the same thing. You go for your promotions or you go for your bonuses, and it's all very, very goal driven.
And it's interesting, and I think there's a Montessori. I really like Montessori as an approach, and I have a member of the family who's a Montessori teacher as well. But I'm aware of some of the criticism. This idea that but we don't know what people are what they're going to learn, and we can't be sure about. And what's really interesting is this ability to kind of explore seems to serve people really well, because a lot of the founders of big Silicon Valley companies, big tech companies, were Montessori educated, far more than by percentage. So it does do something. Whether or not you think that's a good thing is a different matter. But it's like that clearly, if your concern is that someone's going to be materially successful, being Montessori educated is not, obviously nothing's a guarantee of anything, but there are certainly people who are Montessori educated who are very materially successful. And so there's something in that. And I think that's a really interesting point for me as well, is that we assume, we almost, there's this kind of deep thing around like grinding it out, getting to the end goal that you set for yourself, almost out of like self-punishment. I'm not sure what the punishment is. It punishment for having set the wrong goal in the first place? Is it punishment for not being the person you thought you were who wanted that goal? I mean, what are we punishing ourselves for and making ourselves miserable getting to an end point we don't even want?
You have to suffer for whatever success you get, and I think that's another thing that I think society sets us up for. It's like you can't get anything for free. You can't earn the life, like, I mean, celebrities is a case in point. They work hard, they get to where they're going to get to, they get given lots of money because loads of corporates and people want to give them loads of money, but then people turn around to them and say, no, I'm terribly sorry, your life isn't your own anymore, you are ours. So and they end up suffering in that way. So it doesn't matter where you are, it all ends up being the same kind of punishment for doing well,
for enjoying yourself.
Yeah.
Which is it's a really strange thing, and
I'm sure there's some kind of I mean, I'm not religious in any way, but there is that kind of feeling from various religious texts that I've read in the past. That it's like, you have to pay your penitence to things.
I think it is. I mean, I think you can extend it beyond. It's in any absolute belief system, any belief system that won't be revised. And that can. I've met plenty of people who claim to be scientists who had a belief system that wouldn't be revised in the light of evidence. Wow. It's exactly. It's like, well, it's like we can refine the idea, but we can't change the idea. And I think that this gets me to a really interesting point around this. And like, when you're, we were talking about how we're setting up projects, how we're approaching things to do. And before the show, you mentioned thinking about them around the idea of questions rather than kind of just the answers. And I'd really like to explore that a bit further, because it's something I've been thinking about as well. So yeah, what is it? What's the importance of questions in this?
I think for me is we often ask what the outcome of our project is, or whatever it is that we're trying to do, without working out how that necessarily relates back to what we're trying to achieve, or the problem we have that we're trying to solve. So it may be, for example, that we have, like, for me, I'm going to be traveling in a big American school bus next year. So my current problem is how I'm going to earn the money that I need to earn at the same time as homeschooling my daughter, and that at the same time as actually experiencing the life that we've given ourselves. And that means I can't be sitting behind a computer all day managing other people's projects. It's just not going to work. So the problem that I've got to ask myself and that I've got to work out is, how do I create an income stream that allows me to do all those things? And if you go into any kind of corporate entity, the number of places I've been into, and they go, right, we need to achieve this thing in this project. So why? Simple why? And they go, well, because we do, because this many months ago, someone in marketing talked to someone in HR, which came up with this idea that this would be a great idea. We don't know what problem it solves, but we still need to get it done. And the number of conversations I've had like that is kind of madly baffling if I think of the amount of money that's been thrown after these projects. And not only does it mean that you've got projects that they might produce a beautiful result, but they're not solving a problem that anyone's got. But if you're not solving a problem, it comes back to the idea, if you're not solving a problem, if you're not being useful to someone, if you're not helping someone, how can the people in the team who are delivering that project actually get invested in it? Because ultimately we work on projects because we want to do something useful and good.
Yeah, I think there's also something relatedly around, there are two approaches to finding yourself with a solution in search of a problem. And perhaps the one preferred by many people in their marketing, and I do quite a lot of marketing work with people, but the conventional marketing space is to create a problem out of thin air, essentially, to make people think that something that wasn't previously a problem is a problem. And that, given that we have, well, maybe I'm speaking for myself here,
the fitness industry is built on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so much around the coaching and change industry, that kind of, that we're somehow deficient and we need to change, and that's then a problem. It's a really, it's actually quite a pernicious way to approach things, and it lends to people kind of being trapped and actually, you perpetuate the suffering that you're claiming to alleviate, and it's a really quite a trap. And I suspect you're right, actually. It's a trap just as much, if not more, for the people kind of working on it and delivering it than it is for the people who end up using any service like that.
Yeah, and I think the what tends to also happen is that you might ask this question, and let's say you have a genuine problem that you're trying to solve. We're not stuck in one place. We're all constantly evolving, and if you kind of say, the average project, let's say, lasts around 3 months, it's the magical 3 months of project time, but you probably came up with the idea 3 months before that, because that's how stuff works. Are you in the same position as a company, as an individual, 6 months ago compared to 3 months ago compared to now? And are you asking the right question? So it's not only a question of, are you asking the right question at that one moment in time, but are you asking the right question or solving the right problem on an ongoing basis? It moves, and it has to move. And if no one's owning the problem that you're solving, then you're going to end up, who knows where, solving who knows what.
Yeah, solving a problem that doesn't really exist, I guess.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting, because one of the things in my work is particularly when you're engaging with these kind of complex problems, is by definition they can't be fully predicted. You can't, however hard you kind of compute, however hard you think about it, however hard you plan, you can't know what's going to happen. You kind of have to run it to see. You have to do it to see what it's like. Plus, then there's a whole category of other problems where you could potentially figure it out. It's just not worth it. It's actually just easier to run it, figure it out.
Yeah.
And so when we do that and we kind of learn from these things, we're going to be updating, we're going to be learning. But there's something in that desire to carry on regardless of what we learn, and not to learn as you go. It's like, okay, we'll learn at the end.
If you're lucky.
At the end, yeah, we'll have a lessons learned meeting where we talk about how specific people are to blame for the things that didn't go right. Lessons,
or it'll be a tick box exercise 6 months after the project's ended, where no one can remember anything anyway, and then everyone gets on with their day.
Yeah. The lesson learned is you did it wrong. A kind of blame apportionment rather than anything else.
Yeah.
And I think it's a really strange thing. It's a really strange way to approach ourselves and other people, actually, because there are very few people who set out at work without good intentions. We may or may not successfully carry them out, but broadly, pretty much everyone has good intentions. Their intentions are positive. They're just, we might be very unskillful in meeting those, but they're good. And so if we're blaming people, we're saying, well, you didn't know enough, or you weren't skillful enough to carry that out. And that's a very strange thing for an organization to say. It's
is that not how we're, I guess is that not also that kind of societal conditioning of you can't trust anybody, everybody's out for themselves, because that's the kind of structure that's being almost put in place at any one point in time, because that's otherwise you wouldn't need to have all of these different frameworks for checking and monitoring and all of these kinds of things. It's all set up almost to the lowest common denominator, get that word out, of ability, of trust, of everything. So you're managing to people's lowest abilities and not pushing them to be able to fulfill their highest abilities. And if people aren't interested and they're not challenged, then they will do poorer work because it's not as engaging.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's definitely something in that, how we engage, you know, what that interest is and what that does for us in a slightly different way. And you know, the idea that we don't need to be interested in a problem, we don't need to. And it's interesting, like just playing with the words, like interest has multiple meanings. I can say I'm interested in terms of it's intellectually appealing, but interested also means having a stake in the thing. You know, so who has a stake in the problem? Who has something at stake in this? Because I think for me, those are the people who really have an interest, and they often miss out in the process completely.
Yeah, and a lot of people are they are working on a problem per se without actually having any connection to the people who are impacted by it. So, I mean, you know, government contractors or whatever, people who are being employed to work on a problem, but they haven't spoken to a single person who this particular problem affects. They're just told to put in place a solution regardless. And I think there's a lot of ways that in a project that you can increase engagement and you can increase people's interest in things just by giving them exposure to people who are impacted by stuff, whether it's talking to a customer or whether it's talking to someone affected by, I don't know, burst water mains or whatever it is that you're dealing with. That interpersonal connection is so huge, because you may not have first-hand experience of it, but if you talk to someone and you hear their emotion and how it's affected them and all of that kind of thing, it matters. And all of the projects that I've ever worked on where it's gone well has been that there's always been that connection with the client or with whoever it is that they want to win for them. They want it to go well for them. It's not necessarily the interest in the subject matter. You know, there's so many projects you work on that you're like, yeah, I have no idea why anyone would want to do this. But if you like the person you're working for, you don't even have to like them. You just respect their ambition, or you respect what they're trying to do, or then that can go a long way.
I think that focus on the person and the people involved is very often feels like something that's often overlooked. Is there's context all around us, you know, it's all happening in context, and it feels like these solutions, and you know, I've worked on a lot of kind of solution implementation projects and solution procurement projects and all of that stuff, and I've never really seen anything that was genuinely a solution to a problem. It might help a bit, but it never does. It never solves the problem. They're all sold like they're going to solve everything. And they don't. Nothing can, because complex system, complex problem. If we make the problem go away, we make the good stuff go away as well.
Yeah.
So how can we work with that?
Yeah. I was walking part. There's an art installation on Worthing Seafront, and I think it's called Homeless and Hunted or something like that. But it's basically specifically about homeless women and how the situation for them is very different. And there was a quote from one of the women that they basically gave out cameras so that people could take pictures of what they were experiencing. And the quote from one of the women, she talked about how the help that they're given is never the help they ask for. And it struck me as so poignant that this woman who's sitting there being given a camera to take a picture of her life from her tent under a bin somewhere, and all of the experiences that she's gone through. No one has ever asked her what she needs in order to get out of the hole she's in, because people always assume that they know better than this person who's in this situation. And I think it's a really kind of very emotive example of that problem, and it's something that happens all around us all of the time.
And I think you're completely, it's a really good example, because it shows that break of the link between the actual problem and a solution. And there's some pretty good research now, repeated a couple of times in different countries, that the single best way to address addiction and homelessness is to give people houses. No, literally, it's also the cheapest way. That's the irony, is that it's cheaper than all of these other interventions. But there's something that we resist kind of doing it. We resist that. It's like, well, they're homeless, so there must be some underlying cause, and we can't give them a house to sort it out. And we must there's something moral in that, it's like they failed somehow. Again, it comes down to this kind of weird thing for like suffering for your needs, but actually the quickest way to solve homelessness turns out to be to give people houses, give people housing, secure housing. And then all the addiction and all the other stuff sorts itself out.
Yeah.
And it's a really weird one. And I think like maybe we're just off on a complete oblique tangent to the topic that we're talking about. But yeah, I'm not entirely sure how it comes back to that. But there's something about, actually, maybe it's something around failure. It's something around how like trying to do something and then it going wrong is a moral problem. You're like, okay, we found this out, there's something actually that kind of sticks to the person. A failure, failure kind of hangs. It's like if you've dropped out of the system, it's kind of okay to not be very ambitious. But to be ambitious and then fail is a big problem. And it's interesting, it relates to the subjects at school and what we're studying. And I dropped out of university because I turned out I was studying the wrong subject. And it turned out to actually, it was a much better decision for me than carrying on, I suspect, in hindsight. But and I studied later and studied something that was interesting and did really well. So it's a really interesting one. But there is still that kind of stigma around having dropped out. And again,
I changed my degree. I started out doing French and English law degree in London, and partway through I kind of realized that if I carried on doing that, even though I love French language, the only thing I would be learning is French law. So I wouldn't actually be learning any of the stuff that I wanted to do, and I would have to do the compulsory subjects in the English law side. And I decided that I couldn't. So I dropped out of the dual honours course and went for the normal one, which meant that I then spent the next 2 years basically doing dissertations on whatever the hell I wanted, and ended up with a much more interesting, much more valuable to me degree than I ever would have done otherwise. And it could be perceived as being a failure because I didn't come out with a qualifying law degree. I came out with a kind of an interest subject degree. But the skills I learned along the way, I wouldn't change them at all, ever. They're invaluable every single day of everything I do.
Yeah, and I think this is another thing that plays out to this, is that the specific solution versus the stuff that generalizes and the stuff that you can use more regularly and that you can bring between projects, between efforts, between things that you're doing. And I think very often it feels to me like getting to that end goal is all about that specific situation, forgetting that there'll be another one along soon, forgetting that we'll be doing another one of these in 6 months' time, something different, unless we found the final answer to everything and we can just keep doing this exactly the same over and over again forever. Sounds quite boring to me, but that doesn't sound like a good situation to be. But I think I've worked with many people for whom that felt like their intention. That's what they wanted. That's how they wanted the world to be. It's like, we've solved it now. We can just keep doing this exactly the same until till the entropic heat death of the universe.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are probably on one end of a spectrum of being able to stick with long-term projects, not the long-term project end. But at the same time, I think that in itself, if you think of like the broad range of people and what they're interested in and what they're good at and all of those kinds of things, the average project length for any particular person is going to vary massively as well. It's like if you have a lifelong goal of, I don't know, curing some kind of cancer, that's going to be your dedicated focus. And you may have different paths of inquiry that you pursue at any point along that, but you have this big overarching goal. For the rest of us, we may not have that kind of big overarching goal, but we will still have these multiple paths of inquiry, and each one of those is as valid as something that lasts longer. But society seems to be of the opinion that something that is longer, that is more substantial, has greater value, whereas actually it's not true. It just depends. Like, I can do something faster or slower than someone else, so I may do something at a different pace. And that has to play out as well, the individuality of people and how we do things and what we get out of stuff, the lessons we learn that we can transmit onto other people. It's all different. We come at it from different perspectives, and I don't think that's valued enough.
I think there's an interesting thing in there for me about the lessons you learn about yourself, as well as the lessons you learn about the world, and like, well, what is a good fit for me? What do I enjoy? And I'm on my own journeys like that. That's why I work with the early stages of things. I work with the first part of things, because that's where I get excitement and interest. And I don't have much interest in optimizing something that's already known and already explored. And that's like understanding. We partly maybe because we're not raised to do it. Actually, giving yourself the chance, the opportunity to pay some attention to what you enjoy and what you want is a really powerful thing, because then you can orient towards it a bit more. And if you don't know what that is because you haven't experienced it for 20 years at work, it's a very hard thing to find again all of a sudden. And so I think giving yourself the chance to play with this stuff is actually and allowing yourself, it's not so much failure as just like exploration, letting yourself find things that work and find things that don't work. And that's a thing for you personally, and changes over time as well, potentially. So I think that fixity, setting out, doing what you set out to do is like, it's like having a fixed purpose. It's like, this is my purpose. It aligns you and everything that you're about with doing one thing. And
which is great if you have that clarity of purpose, which most people don't, and it's seen as being a negative thing. It's seen as, and I mean, goodness knows how many coaching programs are there out there helping you to find your purpose and helping you to find the one thing that will drive you towards wherever, I don't know where, but I think it's totally seen as, I mean, in school, what do you want to be when you grow up? Oh, such and such wants to be a fireman, a policeman, a doctor, a bin man, I don't know, whatever. But it gets repeated over and over again. Oh, if you want to do that, you have to do this subject, this subject, this subject. So your path is already set out for you, because society has dictated that if you want to be a doctor, you have to do this, this, and this to get there. Hang on a minute. What if I don't like biology, physics, and maths? What if actually I really love doing languages and I want to do English, French, German, and psychology or something, but I still want to end up there? I can still end up there. It might just take me longer. But at the same time, maybe I'll be better if I go that way around, because I'll have a more rounded appreciation of stuff. I'll be able to communicate with people better. I can still take in information. It'll be in a different way. And I think that understanding that you can still get to that place, but you've got to do it in your way rather than follow these steps that you're not interested in is really key.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important one. That finding that fit and finding the steps. And it's interesting because definitely holding an intention is really helpful, but the way that you make it towards that thing is it being as flexible as possible with that. It's like what is available to me now, what is available in the environment now. What can I do? What do I want to do? And trusting that voice, that what I want to do is actually a valid thing. I think we're taught to distrust it. So it's like coming to trust that is a really, really big thing.
But also I think we're kind of encouraged to do things as quickly as possible. Get to that end goal as quickly as possible, and then you can move on to something else. And in some conversations it's then you can go and do something interesting.
Yeah.
And that speed element, that need to move through things as quickly as possible, completely negates our ability to play, our ability to follow our interests, because following our interests and playing is by its very nature not a speedy thing, because why would you speed up something that you're enjoying doing?
That's a really interesting question. I think that there's a learning element to this and an exploration. And for me, play and learning are much closer related than we ever give them credit for. We kind of think of formal learning and like largely pushing ideas into your head and then regurgitating them verbatim, and then play as a different thing. Whereas actually, adaptively, play is about exploration and understanding and developing. That the reason animals play is because it's adaptively valuable. It helps. It makes them better at being them. And the idea that we give that up, particularly in work, I think, we forget that. I think that's a really important thing, in terms of the practical ways to implement that, building some space in for play, building some gaps in to play with this stuff and not having to get straight to an idea. And also, for me, I think is like, if you do find yourself in that situation, how can you make it simpler so there is some room for play? How can you remove a couple of bits? What don't you have to do? What don't you really have to do? What are you doing just because someone said we should probably do that?
And I guess for me, in project world, that would come back to answering the question of what problem are you actually trying to solve in the first place? Because if you can solve that problem with half of the thing that you're trying to produce, you just bought yourself a whole bunch of time.
Yeah, completely. And there's definitely feels like something, almost feels like cheating. It's like, this feels not allowed on some level.
I had a conversation. I once put I can't remember what the quote was, but I put a question up on Facebook ages ago, asking people what they felt about the word shortcut and whether they believed that shortcuts existed. And they were like, yeah, obviously there are shortcuts, but it implies that you're kind of reducing the quality of something, or you're kind of cutting corners, or you're doing this, or you're doing that, you're doing the other. And it was really interesting that the perception of this shortcut. Whereas if you take someone who is super interested in something and is an expert in something, it's not a shortcut, because they just do it 12 times faster because they've done it a million times over. Whereas the average person wouldn't. And I think the psychology around getting to something quick, cutting corners, hacking things is very fascinating in this area.
Yeah, there's kind of finding ease in things, and that's a big theme. It's like, how do we engage with this stuff with from a place of easy? Where's the easy in it, rather than trying to do something, trying to trick the world and trick ourselves into finding a way to get it easier, and something more around, the intrinsic, the values that are there already. What do we have already? Where are we starting from, really, rather than trying to create a situation where we then do have what we then do have what we want, perhaps. Something so really.
When you're working with people on these complex problems, do you come across this kind of need to rush to the end of things?
Yeah, very often there's a sense that there's an external pressure, and I experience it myself as well, let alone with other people. So I think there's always this sense of not being able to kind of stop and enjoy and trust that stuff, and it's a very, very hard pattern to break. It's a really hard, and I think it's also something, because we don't tend to do it very well, we don't practice it, it's actually not very easy when we start doing it. And so it's something that we develop over time, and a capability to develop over time, rather than, again, it's not something you can just follow a recipe for, and it's a discovery process. So I think that is actually the really big challenge, is allowing yourself space for the discovery process, and allowing yourself to then do something different, to take that like, okay, well, I was doing this and that was working then, and then I found out this, and so I'm going to do this instead. And that actually allowing yourself to do that, and there's a feeling that you're going to be kind of, shamed for it, or you're going to be punished for it in some way. And my experience is that actually that isn't the case. But so like worrying, like dropping that worry, or like leaning into, working with that worry is probably the primary way to do it. That you're going to get in trouble if you do something different, if you don't do what you said you were doing, you do something different instead. Then it's like, okay, and most people get it.
Yeah. Interestingly, there was one company that I've worked with that we actually used people as kind of peer facilitators, if you like, in kind of challenging people as to whether, in a really friendly way, obviously, but challenging people as to whether the project that they were working on, whether that actually did answer all the questions. And it was because we find it really hard to answer those questions for ourselves. It's only when someone else challenges us and kind of starts asking things, why are you doing that, or what would you do if you had completely free reign? Like, what if this, that, and the other was true? Would you do this the same way? And it was only in those situations that a really good, solid understanding and interest in what they were doing came out, and that worked really nicely. So I can totally understand why that would work that way.
That questioning, I think it's allowing yourself to ask questions of yourself and other people. I think allowing yourself to ask questions of yourself is a huge thing. And it's like, well, okay, well, this was working and this isn't. But how can we learn? How can we reflect if we can't ask questions? And I think as a kind of, for me, as a kind of trying to wrap this up a little bit, that idea, it's okay to ask questions, and it's okay to question. It's okay to question what we set out to do. It's okay to say, is this still the goal?
Oh yeah, I think totally.
This is a like as a thing that you're allowed to do. That's a big thing.
It's okay to ask that question, but it's also okay to answer, no, this isn't what I'm meant to be doing anymore. This isn't what's going to work for me anymore.
Completely.
For sure.
Cool. No, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Kirsty.
Yeah, thank you. It's been fun.
In terms of, if people want to like this conversation and they want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that? I think we've got your LinkedIn and I'm trying to remember what we've got. Yes,
LinkedIn,
we've got
email. Yeah, either of those.
We've got the LinkedIn in the show notes, so people can connect with you on LinkedIn, which is great. Thank you very much for joining us today. It's been a really, really good conversation. So really, really enjoyed that one. It went, as ever, it went slightly different place to where we'd intended, but that's kind of the point. We really wouldn't have been doing this topic justice if it had gone where we'd expected, I suppose. So thank you everyone also for watching. It really is your viewership and your support that makes this possible and makes it okay for me to just have really random, interesting conversations with people, which is what I like doing. So this recording and others are available on the YouTube channel, so do check that out. Do share it out with anyone you think might be interested. There's also a podcast available. If you search Delightful Dissent on your favorite podcast platform, you'll be able to find the audio versions of these. If you're not, as we're all not, probably better off not sat right in front of a computer watching a computer for even more hours every day. So if you want something to entertain you whilst you do the washing up, then you can also check out episodes there. I really hope this got you thinking. If it did, and you've got any questions and you want to share them, do share them with other people and do share them with us. You've got our contact details in the show notes. The next episode is going to be with Stephen Dargan, and we're going to be looking at the idea that that's just the way it is, and what we can do when we encounter that's just the way it is. And that will be at 1 p.m. UK time on Tuesday, the 11th of May, so a little under a week from today. And I think it's a really interesting topic because I've explored quite a lot on this show around, acceptance and kind of presence and like working with what is. But there's something really important in there about that doesn't have to stay the same. That doesn't always have to be what was, and how we can work with that. And that's just the way it is, but then how we can change things as well, but do that from a place of not forcing it onto the world. And I think it's really nice how a lot of these shows link up, and we've kind of touched on some of the themes today as well about that. So yeah, do join me for that next week. And in the meantime, go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks very much, and goodbye.